Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to Todd and Scott. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's great to get both of you in an interview together, considering we're dealing with 17 hours worth of time zone differences. So thank you for joining me today.
No worries.
Yeah, no worries.
For those who don't know the two people that are in front of me, we have Todd D'Arcy, who is the sole developer of Falling Frontier itself, and Scott Buckley, who is the man behind all the music that you get to experience in the videos and eventually when you play the game itself. So sound design in video games has always fascinated me since I was like a kid. And even today as a content creator, it's often the execution of it that has an effect on how well I receive the game, kind of that whole immersion factor. So first off, a compliment to the entire game from that exact perspective. It's what led me to want to do this interview with both of you guys in the first place. There are a lot of tiny minutia pieces that I think really grabbed a hold of me that I don't experience in many games at all. And I love that idea a whole bunch. So to get started, we'll get some really simple basics. And in Falling Frontier itself, and this is to Todd, how do you go about creating the sounds for the games? Like, do you use a sound pack? Do you use custom recordings? And kind of what factors play into all of your sound choices?
Yeah, so I do use a lot of sound packs, but I usually change them a bit post. Plus, there's also the mixing, the live mixing process that I do in Fmod, which is an application that talks to game engines, and it allows you to change things dynamically based upon parameters and things like that. But we can get into that a bit later. So I do use sound packs. I do also create some sounds myself. Those are more vocals, and then like the garbled vocals you hear and stuff like that. I do that. Well, I do a lot of that myself, and just then run them through multiple clamps and distortions to kind of get that Battlestar Galactica kind of, you kind of know what they're saying, but you're not too sure what they're saying.
Yeah, I've always wondered how the communications roll within the game. It's like, do you have just a bunch of voice lines that you got from somewhere, or what you're doing yourself? So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, but for the bulk of the sound effects, so gun sounds and cannon sounds and stuff, that they are sourced sound packs. As a solo developer, there's only so much you can do, and if I had the time, I'd just be there with pots and pans just banging them together, not knowing what I'm doing, so it's probably not wise.
That would be pretty cool, actually. Every time a torpedo fires, it's just a pan gong, yeah,
here comes the pan starship. Yeah, so that's how a lot of the sounds are actually designed. And so about the choice of the sounds, the world of Falling Frontier from start to finish, even though it's science fiction, I want it to feel grounded. And so to me, from a sound perspective, what does that sound like? So everything has to have a sense of weight behind it. I mean, these are big starships. It's a big world, even though the combat of starships happens close together, because it's more of a traditional RTS from that perspective, as in the distance of engagements. I wanted the sound to feel as though they were happening at range, kind of thing. So you're sort of looking in. It's almost like the player's perspective is like a high-tech camera that is overseeing what's going on.
Okay.
So that's always been my design goal, that whatever you see should be treated as if it's the fancy sci-fi overlay from a UI perspective to a sound perspective. So there's a lot of distortions that go into creating that oomph, and those are the sort of dynamic sounds I was referring to.
Cool. Well, I guess that kind of leads pretty well into the next question. So when you have all of those things coming in together, what's the structure for implementing that in-game audio? So like, you have your ships, your buildings, space noises. How does that all come together.
Yeah. So how do I do sounds basically?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
So I break up the sounds, sound and music into 5 different categories. So they are 2D, 3D, 3D dynamic, ambient music, and dynamic music.
Okay.
So I'll quickly break those down, and then I'll speak to the specifics about the process of how to implement it from front end to back end. So 2D is a really good way to think about it is anything that doesn't need to have any sort of distance associated with the camera. So it will always be the same regardless of where the player's camera is. So a good example of that would be any UI element. Okay. And also, to a degree, ambient music, you could say, is a 2D sound because that's not changing based upon any action. It's just, the elements of the track's not changing. It might fade out or something like that based upon action, but the actual sound itself is fairly static. Okay. 3D is based upon where the camera is and where the sound emits from in the game world. So a sound object will have a range that it can actually cast, and then based upon where the camera is, all of the fancy code that comes with the software basically figures out how loud it's going to be, and you can define how that fade curve looks like. So is it linear? Does it ramp up quickly and then fade out slowly, sort of thing? You can change all of that. So the third category is 3D dynamic. And I would classify any sound that is manipulated in some way based upon an action. So a really good example of that is, there's lots of examples, but the easiest global example I can give is when the player changes into a certain screen. So for example, the military screen, which is now called the scanning screen, or the logistics view, the camera takes a top-down sort of perspective. Okay. And there's a UI overlay over that whole screen. So it's kind of that sci-fi camera observation perspective again. And so every sound that is played while in that view actually has a clamped distortion on it. So it's like a low pass. So it actually clamps that sound. So it's a bit deeper. It sounds a little bit more muffled. Okay. And then when you come out of that view, you can hear the sound as it was designed to be mixed properly. So that's just a really easy example of a 3D dynamic sound that is changing based upon different actions within the game. And the fourth one is ambient music. So these are just tracks that are playing based upon they could either just play just as backing, or it could also then be triggered by some kind of event, such as perhaps there's a buildup of player forces. So therefore, perhaps a pre-battle track is going to play, even if a battle's not going to occur. That's cool. Just to kind of elevate that sort of tension. And although that is dynamic in terms of which track is playing next, the track itself is not dynamic. It's just basically, just sort of playing. The last one is the dynamic music, which is still a work in progress. Scott and I are still working through that. But those tracks have both a vertical and horizontal progression, which Scott can sort of talk about a bit more. But essentially, there are what drives that progression. So horizontally is how far through the track we have actually progressed, and vertically is how many elements of of that actual score have been layered in. So progression is controlled by things like how many ships are sort of remaining, whereas the vertical layers, which I would call intensity, would be about how intense that battle has actually become, and and these are things that can scale up and down, and then you can loop back through the battle track again if you sort of need to. So essentially, there's an integration package between Fmod and Unity, and in the game engine, you basically create components that have a sound emitter, and then you select what sound file. Well, not what sound file, but what sound profile you actually want. Because in Fmod, you create a bunch of sounds, and those sounds can have multiple audio files that you've mixed together. So that's what you're calling. Cool. And then in the code, you basically say, well, you get a reference to that actual sound profile, and you basically say play. But what causes it to play? What's the trigger? That's what you have to think through. So is it something simple like a cannon firing, or perhaps like an impact sound? Well, then you would play a sound. That's all fairly straightforward. But it's when you get into those dynamic sounds, especially from sort of like a music perspective, that's when they get more complicated, because you're tracking a lot more data to actually drive the music.
Right.
Yep.
That's cool. I like that, because that's one of the things I've always wondered about, how do things trigger? So like in any given situation, how many objects do you think have those sort of audio cues, would you say?
Pretty much every object.
Pretty much every object. Okay.
Every UI button, every object. With UI buttons, you don't need to actually store a sound emitter on the button, because it's a 2D sound.
Right.
You can just have like a sound manager, which has every single button click, and then you've actually got a reference to that sound manager, which is a separate game object that the player can't see. They don't need to see it.
Right.
And you basically call that specific sound file, well, that sound profile from the sound manager, and it just plays. And there's different kind of restrictions you can put in like Fmod. So can only a single instance of a sound play at a time, or can you have multiple? For a button click, you might only want to have one instance playing, because you don't want that really clicky click sound or something like that. But for like a cannon shot, multiple ships might be wanting to use that same sound file, or that sound profile. So then you want to be able to have infinite, or however many you sort of need. And in Fmod, you can do things like actually randomly return a sound. So you can have a bunch of sounds that are set up in Fmod that are all part of the same sound profile, and then you can randomly return one of those, so it's different each time.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, so there's lots of different things. You can control the randomness in the game engine, you can control it in Fmod. It just depends on your use case and what you really want to do.
Oh, that's awesome. I love it.
Yeah.
I love that whole aspect of it. This is the stuff that I get real nerdy about, so I appreciate it.
That's all right. It's fairly time consuming, but like sound to me, it's one of your senses, right? So if people, there's obviously lots of people who unfortunately don't have the ability to hear, so they can't experience things how they were designed to be. But for those that are blessed to be able to, I feel it's a medium that you should really try and give 200% to, because it's as important as the visuals, it's as important as the game design. It helps solidify a world, it helps create a world, it helps you remember a world, and it helps you feel a world after that world has stopped.
Yeah, I think one of the coolest parts, so I love the Forge video and just how deep the sounds are and the sounds you can hear in the factory and stuff. But I think one of the that like minutia sort of thing is whenever the ships they drive into jump, there we go, into the rescue trailer, and you have air venting sounds. Like it's that sort of deal that's like, you could leave it without that and no one would really say anything, but like I saw plenty of comments across IGN's video, across your video, that it's just like, he has all of these sounds in. You hear the probes come out of the ship. You hear the air venting. You hear all just the clicks and bangs of space. And it's one of the reasons, a lot of people compare this to almost like The Expanse, but as an RTS. And I think that's one of the things that really shines about that show that I think ports over to your game, is the fact that you have all those tiny little things that really just adds a lot of depth to it that I like a lot.
Oh,
so thank you.
I really appreciate it. And I try to, in everything that I do, I try to have a level of detail that perhaps wouldn't necessarily be there in other TSs. That does limit things to a degree, because you can be stuck on the detail and you have to know when to step away from it, because really you can continue to just go down the detail path as for a long time, and you lose yourself. But that's also why I was very fortunate. I felt very blessed that Scott wanted to come on board, because he has that same care and that same attention to detail, but from a music perspective. Like if you see him work, he just, we'll just go over stuff like, no, it's not quite right, I'm not happy with it. He will just work on it and work on it until it's right,
until it's perfect.
And so his, like, the game wouldn't be the same without Scott's audio tracks.
Agreed.
Without a score.
Well, we're gonna move on to that. Actually, that's kind of the next set of questions.
A good segue.
Yeah, it is. It's perfect. I appreciate it. You definitely don't have the script in front of you whatsoever.
Checks in the mail, my friend. Checks in the mail.
Well, moving on to Scott. You make all of the music for Falling Frontier, and every video there's comments on how great the music is. I ranted about it and the evolution in the Forge video, which I thought was fantastic. I know it's a very, very typical question for this sort of thing, but what was the inspiration and the collaboration between you and Todd, and how that all came together to create the music for the game?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when Todd approached me, when you're talking about this, me to come on, it was one of these questions was a no-brainer. Like, seeing this game, even in its early stages, when Todd showed me, this game looks just stunning, and clearly was something very special that I could see forming. And it was one of those things where you look at this game and immediately I can hear music in my head. Things were just popping in there, and it's like I really got to be a part of this somehow. And so Todd, I'm very glad that Todd asked to bring me on. A lot of our early discussions, we're talking about, I think, were just what we'd expect to see in the sort of the music landscape that we'd want to have in this game. But really, Todd has given me a lot of freedom. He's let me sort of roam free to come up with my ideas as willingly as, it's amazing. And so far he seems pretty happy with it, so I'm glad about that.
I am. I'm quite pleased.
Yeah. I mean, you're not going to say that in an interview right now anyway.
Yeah.
But
well, Scott, I've been meaning to speak to you for a while, and now it seems like a really good time.
Please step into my office.
HR will see you soon.
But I think one of the things that really caught me really early on about this game was this sense of just this vastness of space. This, like, the art design that got into the ships, it has this sort of, I guess, like you're mentioning The Expanse as one example here, but like this idea of where these people that they're not so far into the future. It has this sense where we're not this far-flung future where everything is solved by technology. We're still working at it, and
Mhm.
we're expanding beyond our borders, and this sense this game has about space between points of interest. There's just this, there's
Yes.
this big sort of nature about this, and particularly as well, one of the things I love about the ship design is how slow the ships move. There's this beautiful sort of naval-esque sort of quality to it
Mhm.
that just really drives that vastness home. And so one of the things that I really wanted to capture, in this score was this emptiness and this peace, I guess, that happens in space where it's just this, it's you and the void, and you traveling between these places in these amazing ships. And so that was definitely one quality I wanted to capture in the score. Another part was obviously the human element in this game. I mean, a lot of sci-fi stories, they're always about, they're about technology and all these amazing ideas, but it's mostly about the people in it. Like it's
Right.
these people that are, embarking on these journeys and exploring, and so for me, like sci-fi is always about having that human element to bring it back to, and that was clearly something I also wanted to capture in this score. And I think if and when you hear the main theme for Falling Frontier, I think that's where it captures it the most. Is this it's not a big bombastic epic drum sort of thing. It's
Right.
more about this a soaring, sweeping theme that sort of captures that humanity in this, and I think that's really what I wanted to capture the most, I think.
For sure.
Definitely. That's a great piece, Scott. That's
Thank you.
that's just
Yeah.
like mind-blowingly awesome. I love
Have
it.
we heard the main theme yet?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So I released a trailer called "Keeping with a Theme," I
That's
think,
right.
or "Keeping with a Theme," and so that's the. I didn't show the whole piece. I think I only showed 3 minutes of it, and it goes for close to 6 minutes.
Wow.
I think.
I'm gonna
Yeah,
need that.
something like
yeah. It's a Scott classic. It goes for a while.
Yeah, no,
Which
that's
is
fine.
great.
It's
Like, you
great.
get more bang. Yeah.
It's fantastic. I love long tracks that
Mm.
have that progression with them for sure.
Yep.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think again, like having that length for these tracks also helps with bringing home those ideas of these. It gives you room to just bask in the space that is space. Yes.
So yeah, if it's a little bit more slower paced, you have a good long while between tracks for sure,
Exactly.
which is
Yeah.
good. I like it. So kind of rolling on with that. So I've watched a handful of your Twitch streams. By the way, if you're watching this, go over to his Twitch channel, which will be in the description, and you can go follow him and/or sub, do all the things. But
Thank you.
and you make music, of course, not just for Falling Frontier. This is your full-time job, correct? Am I right?
Actually, not my full time. No,
not your full-time.
No, but a good decent chunk of my time, definitely.
Okay. So one thing that I've noticed in those Twitch streams is the ridiculous amount of layers that you have in the music, which I'm not saying that in a negative light as well. It blew my mind the first time I watched it. I was like, holy cow. So I guess the question is, how do you plan out the structures to these songs? How do you balance them between instruments, and then bringing all that to fit the mood of whatever is happening within the game? Because I assume you kind of have themes within the game of what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, I guess, writing is one of those things where you learn over many, many years, what works and what doesn't work. There might be a particular kind of writing, which is more, this orchestral style. It does take a lot of layers because there's lots of instruments to play,
Yeah.
and they're all played by me, which is, I think, one of the things I love about the way I do it, which is you don't really have a real orchestra. You have a fake one in a computer, and you're sort of building it over time. But yeah, orchestral writing definitely does have a lot of layers, and the style that we're writing here as well. It's not just the orchestra; we're bringing in a lot of electronic elements as well, so a lot of synth and other percussion as well to bolster out the track. So it's definitely, it gets up in there in track count. but it's a lot of a lot of sort of shorthand that I have developed over the years just by just writing so many tracks over and over and over again. There are certain things that you always fall back on as a composer that work. So there's ideas of different kinds of pairing of different instruments will give you this certain styles and certain moods, and you can always rely on them to do those things. And so it's always handy to have these kind of shorthand to emotions when you're a composer, just to be able to throw I don't know. I'm trying to think off the top of my head, but it's certain kinds of instrumentation will make you feel very blissful, very very like some sort of emotion that will manipulate the player. I think that's always going to happen. Yeah.
Perfect, excellent.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I also have structures as well. There's always ways to get into a track at the beginning, and there's always ways to end it. And then there's definitely different sort of shapes and structures to have in the middle to develop the track, but also to help it feel like it resolves. Particularly here with Falling Frontier, because a lot of the ambient tracks, they need to somehow, they join together to create this much bigger score.
Right.
I really want the in and the out to be at a point where it won't feel like a dramatic tone change when they change tracks. So I'm often relying on using the same sort of, if you know music terminology, working in the same or very related keys to start and finish, and also similar styles of instrumentation. So I've kind of got a bit of a style sheet for Falling Frontier in terms of what kinds of instruments I'm using frequently.
Cello,
exactly. Solo cello, a lot of cello.
I love me cello.
Coming back to that. Yeah, it's one of those things where I love it's very human, I think, and that's one of the things where we're talking about the human element. That's definitely something I'm relying on a little bit here. But there's also definitely a style sheet with at least synth patches as well, which have a certain very unique tone that I'm using in a lot of the tracks to kind of meld them together, but also use them in different ways to make the tracks sort of stand out on their own. And also, early on, me and Todd sort of sat down to figure out some ideas in terms of different moods and stuff, to capture, I guess, different use cases in the game, where it might be sort of early on ambience versus sort of later game, sort of urgency that's probably required. Help the player feel like they're a little bit more, in a darker end of the of the timeline.
We spoke about feelings for a bit.
Exactly, we spoke about feelings. It definitely helped us relate a lot closer. We're
right
for it. Yeah.
So that's super cool. I like it. I like it a lot. Just as a little nerdy thing, on average, how many different layers do you have on a given song for Falling Frontier specifically?
A good question.
A lot.
If we're talking, we've got a full orchestra plus some, a bunch of synth tracks as well. It could be about, 50, 60 tracks. But I mean, to be honest, that's pretty low. I know a lot of composers who have absolutely extraordinary track counts in some of their tracks.
That is mind-blowing. That is.
Yeah, so it's... I mean, my templates run a lot longer than, bigger than that, but the active tracks, I guess, the ones that are actually making noises at any given time, it's probably about that, yeah.
Man, that's crazy. I like it though. It's cool. The next question can be for either of you. Probably both of you will have different perspectives on it. So the music tracks, we've talked about this a little bit earlier about how they have that layered evolution. So that idea of horizontal versus vertical. So obviously there is a system to that. How do you coordinate when that evolution happens? So when do you drop in that next step and that next step, or when do you peel back from the big dramatic buildup down to, the silence afterwards? Are there certain triggers? Do you guys coordinate that with each other? Or Scott, do you just send that to Todd and say, hey, have fun, kind of a deal? How does that work?
I think in many ways, I've been sort of relying on Todd to figure out what these cues might be, because he's very much more intimately aware of what's probably going to be the best thing that's going to trigger these things. So maybe Todd can expand a little bit more.
Sure. So I think I touched on it a little bit earlier. So you've got drivers for ambient tracks, and drivers for dynamic tracks. So drivers for dynamic tracks would be things like, so from a technical perspective, you would flag when, a like combat event starts. So that's when more than one object is firing at something. Well, it could just be one object firing at something that's got no weapons, but yeah, so a combat event has started. As more objects enter that combat event, there's like there's a music manager that basically counts what's being involved.
Cool.
Well, these objects get passed to the music manager, and then based upon that, it makes certain decisions as to what classifies as a progression and what classifies as an intensity. So a good example is that from a progression perspective, you've got, so one ship jumps in, starts firing, then two more ships jump in, start firing back, then a couple of more ships jump in. So now you've got 5 ships. So in a short period of time, you've actually increased intensity. And of course, there's a maximum in intensity that you can reach, and you can't layer anything else on like top of that. And you want that intensity to be accessible, but not overly accessible.
Right.
Like, you want a big battle to feel like a big battle and not something that just happens on a Tuesday, right? So, it's got to be something that it's a special thing. And if you're recording it, it's like, wow, this is a special thing. I'm glad I didn't miss that.
Yeah.
And you want it to feel as though it's a moment that only you created, that no one else could have created, even though they could have, but it feels personal to you.
Right.
And the music helps drive that. So that's about scaling in intensity. And if it sits for too long in a certain horizontal loop, then it will naturally go to the next one, because you don't want to keep looping through the same section, which might be like, I don't know how long it is. I mean, we're still working out the specifics of that, but it might be like 40 seconds or a minute might be a horizontal progression loop.
Okay.
So you don't, and although, because it's orchestral and it's multiple layers, that it's not like you're looping 8 seconds of like a drum beat.
Right.
It's like a good chunk of time, so it sounds unique to a degree, but you don't want to stay in that moment for too long. So then you're going to progress next. And then if you stay in that moment for too long, then it will progress again. But as the ships are actually destroyed, when they're destroyed, those details get passed on to the music manager, and it goes, hey, people are dying here. Well, we better tone this back a little bit. And so then it will fade out the top layer.
Okay.
Over
That's cool.
over a period of time. And well, I mean, you can change how long it takes, because you can drive that in like a curve. So how you want to do that, you can feed so the time that it takes is basically controlled within the game engine.
Okay.
From like an Fmod perspective, you're basically controlling volume of a layer. So that's from a volume of 0 to 100.
Okay.
So how long it takes you to go between that, you can do it in a single jarring frame, or you can do it over 2 seconds or over 10 seconds. It just depends on what you want to do. And I could get into complexities of, well, if ships are dying like once every 30 seconds, well, then perhaps it fades out longer, but if if like 3 die very quickly, well then perhaps it's only over 2 seconds. I don't think I'll get into that kind of detail because that's got potential to go wrong,
right?
A bit more easily than everything else. And yeah, so that then drives the intensity down. But then if a couple of more ships join the battle, then you can raise the intensity again.
Gotcha, that's cool.
Yeah, so it's about controlling that. And then so if it gets to towards the end where it would normally cut out, not cut out, but fade, but that end track, that end horizontal component, that it's okay, the track's done. If the battle's still going, well then we can do one of a couple of things. We can go back into the track again, or we can let that fade out, but then very quickly start another battle track. And so then that's a randomness that can be controlled within the game logic as well. So that's the dynamic perspective. From an ambient perspective, that's just different markers of what's the player doing. Are they just building their sort of economy? Do they have a surplus of resources? Well, let's play a hopeful track. This is nice. They're doing well.
You're doing great.
They're prospering for 5 minutes. We'll play a track to just reward you.
That's funny.
But if you're short on ore or fuel, or perhaps you're overextended yourself, well, let's play a darker ambience track because you've gone and messed up. So you can control those things based upon different things like that. And again, as I was saying, so if a player builds a whole bunch of military ships in a short period of time, well, that might trigger some kind of event of, hey, military build-up, let's play a build-up battle track type thing, just to get the player hyped and get them
to make a mistake because they're all excited because the in-game music.
get that whole blood fury thing going on. It's like then they commit their forces, and then when they die, you play the dark ambience track because you messed up again. So
that's really cool though.
Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of different things we can lead into and lead out of. And Scott and I even spoke about that for the battle tracks, the ending would be changed based upon the outcome. So did you win? Did you lose?
Gotcha.
And those things
that's fantastic.
And those things have to be driven by numbers, right? So you might have had the victory from a perspective of that you lost less, but to you it might not have been a good outcome. So that's kind of challenging as well, because then you're playing this slow clap ending to a battle track.
But it makes sense though, because you have like a victory in which you just wiped out a fleet with minimal losses, or you're barely limping out of a battle and you won, but man, that really hurt.
So I mean, we've only spoken about a couple of different endings, but it might be something that we speak about further, to perhaps just have that kind of, well, I won, but I got hit hard kind of thing. So it's a victory ending, but it's not quite a triumphant. Exactly. So we'll see where that goes, because I want it to just, when you design things, you have to design it from like a bucket perspective. Okay, so most people are going to fit into these sort of buckets,
right?
But there's always going to be edge cases that you just can't capture. And you can try to do your best, but there will always be edge cases that you didn't think of, or you couldn't capture, or perhaps the situation that you were designing for was fine, but there's this other event that from a code perspective is completely unlinked, but from a player emotional perspective is completely linked, and you can't allow for that. So there are design challenges with how do you drive those things. From a trailer perspective, I basically always layer the music in, so in like post, purely because from a sound perspective, because the game is in development, the sounds haven't been mastered, so well,
Right.
not all of them have. So you'll have some that might be too loud or a bit too quiet, and so there can be a need to alter the volume of a trailer so it's more consistent. It doesn't happen often, but it can be there. And if you've got the music in there as well, then you're playing with the sound of that. And you might want to highlight a specific event in game, and the music might be a bit loud at that point in time. So then you want to be able to dip the music down to help. So
there's a lot going on.
Yeah. So from a trailer perspective, the music is always added afterwards. It just gives you greater control, that then you don't have to go in and record the whole thing again and waste an extra 20 minutes recording, and then, I know it's not quite right, go back in again. But the main track in the Forge trailer, I said to Scott, like, just how this has started is really going to work for this dust cloud. And I showed him the dust cloud. It's like, oh yes, this is going to work well. So, I don't think he said, oh yes. That's my.
Yeah.
That's what he said. By golly gosh, this is going to work well, he said. Gee whiz, Jiminy jams. So we could see that this track that he was just working on, that started as like a darker ambient track, very much became about the volumetric fog.
Yeah.
And so that track is now kind of almost exclusively for when you're in the volumetrics.
Very cool.
So that track does belong there, and it just happened to be timed fairly well that things happened when they did, and I just put that like track straight on the top, and it
worked.
matched perfectly. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. So nailed it, Scott. Well done.
Very nice.
Well, you gave me inspiration, my friend. Absolutely.
He won the game.
Yeah. Just a few more questions and we'll wrap this up. And you mentioned this relatively extensively already, Todd, but they kind of go together. So what would be your biggest struggle from a sound design perspective? And also, what are you most proud of? Now, this is for both of you. So designing the music and then implementing things in game.
Sure. Scott, would you like to go first, or?
Okay.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, sure. So one of the, I think, I haven't made this, like a secret, but this is definitely my first game of this scale that I've scored, and so I think probably the biggest struggle for me is actually learning the lexicon of what's required here, like the understanding what goes into a game score, and learning Fmod and understanding essentially how this all works. But more than that, though, actually the compositional elements of this, particularly talking about this dynamic, elements to this. How do you compose this? Like I've always been a very linear composer. Like start at the beginning and go to the end, and so I've done a lot of work in advertising and film, and that's been my, it's easy to do because there's always a time code at the beginning and it goes to a set time code at the end. It won't change. Whereas this is obviously a very different beast where you have no idea where the player will end up. So I mean, it's probably good that we have much of it where it's we is kind of linear in a way. The ambient tracks that Todd's been talking about, but there are other elements to this where it's like I'm sort of rethinking how does music work? I don't know anymore. I'm what am I doing with my life? I don't know.
Existential crisis.
Yeah.
But that's also been like amazing. Like I live for these kinds of the ability to learn and grow and learn new things. So this is it's been a struggle, but also fantastic to
Very
learn.
cool.
So,
yeah, he's done an amazing job.
Absolutely. I would agree completely.
and I can't wait for people to hear his work in game. Because I just listen to it just while I work.
So do I. Yep. No, I regularly have.
I just like, I'm going to listen to some Falling Frontier right now and just start the code. And I don't know if that is like self-serving or if that's just
quite the narcissist over here, listening to my own music.
Well, it's not mine, but it's
true.
But it is inspirational, and it is. I mean, so before Scott actually started writing specifically for Falling Frontier, I had a whole bunch of his like other tracks in there as well, and I still use tracks that aren't Falling Frontier specific, but they are his for trailers, because pretty much everything he writes sounds like it belongs in Falling Frontier.
Yeah, it works very well.
It's like, I just look at the Falling Frontier catalog. It's dozens upon dozens of tracks to pick from. Yeah, it's like a kid in a music candy store.
Yeah.
Happy to help.
Yeah, thanks, buddy. But so the same question for me. I guess the biggest struggle, and again, this isn't a secret. This is my first computer game. So they say if you're going to make a game, you shouldn't make an RTS. Well, a strategy game. So I thought, how hard can it be? That old sound effect. And it's hard. It's very hard. I went into many years of prototyping and practicing and just developing my skill sets, which will never be complete. I mean, there's not a programmer in the world that knows everything, that doesn't get advice from external resources, just whether that's a colleague or whether that's Googling something that they're trying to understand. Because the brain is best suited for things like working through problems, not necessarily always remembering everything.
Right.
So if you can train yourself to work through problems instead of just having to retain every single bit of information, then it's actually a lot easier. Although the retaining does help. Just when you want to, how to do stuff. So the biggest struggle for me was I'm one guy trying to do everything. And I'll happily admit that sound design was not something that I prototyped at all or anything like that. So and for a couple of years, almost Falling Frontier had very few sounds at all.
Which is technically correct. I mean, vacuum of space and stuff, but
technically correct. Yeah, it's physically accurate, guys. Come on. But I got to a point where I thought, I have to add sounds to this thing. What do I do?
Oh no.
Oh no. And so I had to learn, had to skill up, had to teach myself, had to fail a lot in a very short period of time, had to fail fast to learn what works and what doesn't work. So from a sound design perspective, that's probably been the biggest struggle, just having to learn, which, I've certainly gotten over that hurdle now. But there was a period of time where I had no idea what I was going to do. I knew what I wanted to do because it was always an idea in the back of my mind that I could always hear the sounds in my mind. It's not the same as hearing voices. I could hear the sounds, and I could hear the soundscape. And so I knew what I wanted it to be, but I didn't know how to get there, which is often what a dream is, right? Like you've got a dream of something, but you don't know how to get there. And the way to bridge that is to start doing. And the first step or the first 1,000 steps might not even get you one step closer to that destination, but you learn the ways not to go, which means that when you get on the path to get there, it's the right one, which is actually more important than getting it right the first time, because if you get it right the first time, you actually don't know, is this the best way to do it? So that was probably the biggest challenge. And what I'm most proud of, I guess, would be, how it sounds. at the moment. I do get a lot of feedback about the sound design. I mean, there are some people that say, "Why can I hear sounds in space?" It's like, well, it's a game.
It's a game.
It'd be boring. It'd be
Come
boring if it
on,
was
people.
quiet. It's like it's
just
a game.
mute the audio when you play the
Yeah.
game if you want it completely accurate. Like
Yeah, but I get a lot of comments about how it, how it feels to people. How it drives home a certain grounded sense of a world, which is something that I always wanted to do. But that was a part of the dream, to have this very broad soundscape, but also one that's incredibly familiar. Because the problem with sci-fi, well, not the problem, but one of the characteristics of sci-fi is that you can go too alien sounding, and then you can lose a certain attachment, especially if it's a new IP, so it's not a well-established IP. It's not how people imagine things might sound from perhaps like a book or something like that. It's like, no, you are showing people right from the get-go how something sounds.
Right.
So you want to have that emotional attachment to it. And so I'm fairly proud of that I think for the most part it hits more than it misses.
For sure. No, I completely agree. Well, like you said, it's the human aspect, where this isn't Star Wars, where, there are trillions and trillions of people across endless galaxies and sort of stuff. Like, this is still home. Like, especially with Titan Rising, we're still on our own solar system. We're not living in these luxurious massive ships, like we've talked before. They're basically submarines in space, so like there's little to no luxury from what I've seen, and I don't think that's what you want to get across either. So having that emotional tie-in to really ground everything, I think really comes off very well.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, so the last question, what is your hope that the sound design accomplishes for Falling Frontier?
So my hope, from a holistic perspective, from both the in the game sounds and the music, so the whole sound package, is that sound, specifically music, is one of the triggers for emotions. You've got taste and things like that, which allow you to match that to something, and so I wanted the sound design to be something that lived on for people for decades to come. And a really good example of that is a game called Total Annihilation. It was one of the first games that had an amazing soundtrack that still to this day you could listen to, and you can tell it's aged a little bit, right? But it stands up as an amazing score. And if I listen to that, I remember how I felt playing the game at the time, and I hope the whole sound package does that for people. So I'm thinking long term, so a decade, two sort of decades from now.
Timeless perspective.
A timeless perspective. My hope is that the sound design stays with people in a part of their hearts that they reserve for Falling Frontier. And that might sound a bit dramatic, a bit soppy, but
not at all.
That's what I hope. I hope the whole package does that there's this box that is kept for this game, and people that might be 15 or younger now, however old they are, that they experience this game, that they'll get to my age now and my young age now or older, and they'll think back to that game, Falling Frontier, and I know it won't be the visuals that they remember. Clearly they won't, because by that point games will look so much better, right? And as much effort that I've put into that, I know that won't be remembered in 20 years from now. What will be remembered is the sound, because people remember it with how they felt. So that's my hope for the sound.
Very cool. Scott.
My thoughts actually mirror a lot of what Todd's saying. I think of all the games that I've played in my life, the ones that really stand out to me are the games where I've had an experience that was very much enhanced by an amazing score. Total Annihilation actually is one of those games. But probably the first one I really remember having that sort of experience with was Morrowind.
Yeah, I was going to say Morrowind. Yeah.
Which is the same composer, actually, Jeremy Soule.
Yeah.
And it's this ability for that music to just become part of your story when you're playing that game. And so I think of all these games that I've played, the most memorable ones are where that music has contributed so much to that story that's been told. So my hope for this is actually to make a score that helps someone else have that same experience in Fallen Frontier. And
very cool.
And I really hope I can achieve that.
I think you guys have accomplished it so far, at least. And I would totally agree. I mean, I grew up with city building strategy games my entire life, but right off the top of my head, the three best ones that I can remember are Stronghold, Caesar 3, which is a very, very old soundtrack, and Age of Empires 2. Like, I could hum a dozen songs from each of those games, and that's what I remember the most about them. I can hear something that sounds like it that may not be remotely tied to it, but it'll immediately conjure up that game. So yeah, like that's, I think people don't put enough emphasis on how crucial music and sounds are to a game. Which is half the reason why I want to do this interview, because the sounds within this game are just that good, and I think they are that memorable.
Thank you.
So I think you guys are spot on with the hope, and I think it'll work very, very well.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep. That's all I got. So, so this has been really good. I got a lot more information than I was expecting. This, like I said, it's a really nerdy passion of mine, because again, as we just, it's super crucial to every game. And so I really appreciate you guys taking the time to explain in depth all of the different nuances and everything that goes into it. Yeah.
Pleasure.
That's all I got.
Thanks for taking the time to chat to us. It's
for sure.
That's been good fun.
For having us.
Sure.
For all of you who are watching this at the end, all the links to all of these guys will be in the description below. So definitely go check out Scott Buckley. He's got Spotify playlists, he streams, all that sort of thing. And of course, go on Stutterfox Studios on YouTube to watch any new videos. Thank you guys again for hanging out with me, and I hope y'all have a pleasant night and a pleasant start to your day.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
All right, I'll see you guys later.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.